Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Waffle Podcast with Em and Pixie.
Woohoo!
And together we'll try to talk about research about any gobbledygook. Each episode we'll be talking to a researcher who will discuss the work they're doing, looking at why this research is important and asking how did they get into this field. We hope that it will be informative and interesting and bring a bit of the academic world into the real world. Today we have Dr Tim Beasley-Murray, who is Associate Professor of European Thought and Culture at UCL's Arts and Humanities faculty. Hi Tim, thank you ever so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Pixie. Thank you, Em.
That's lovely. So do you want to start by telling us a bit about your research?
Yes, absolutely. So in a way, my research is perhaps, I like to think, absolutely ideal for this podcast, which is about, on the one hand, anti-waffle, and on the other hand, trying to get academics thinking about how they can communicate with a more real world. So my book that I'm just writing an introduction. I need to find a good title for it, but at the heart of it, it has the notion of games and play. And I look at two sorts of games. And I think for this podcast, I really want to talk about or games in relation to two areas. On the one hand, literature as a game, games that we play in literature, maybe literature itself as a game. And on the other hand, the whole business of doing academic work in the humanities, right? And maybe for this podcast, I'd like to talk about that first bit a little bit more. Because you said right at the beginning, how academics talk to the real world. Well, that's a really interesting idea. And in fact, my book starts off with a little sort of story, and the whole book is quite playful. It's a bit of a game, but maybe this will be quite a nice way in. So I studied at Cambridge, and in Cambridge, there's a piece of green called Parker's Piece, okay? A sort of big little sort of park, really. And really, it sort of ends up separating off the beautiful sort of university centre of Cambridge with its spires and colleges and quads and the river and so on, from a more sort of ordinary piece of Cambridge off Mill Road with its sort of streets with little houses, and with, it used to have, shops maybe a bit more diverse and so on. And in the middle of Parker's Piece, there are two paths that cross the big expanse of grass, and in the middle there's a lamppost, a little bit like the one in The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, that stands right in the middle of this, and it had for years and years scratched on into the paint of the lamppost, and now it's been replaced by a formal sign that has been paid for by the city council. It's a reality checkpoint, right? So the idea was that somehow when you were going from Cambridge, the university area with its dreaming spires, and that's an interesting word. I know we normally talk about Oxford with dreaming spires, but then when you went over to Mill Road and the sort of, shops where you could buy Asian food and slightly dingy pubs and so on, you were leaving something and you were entering the real world, right? Now, what does this distinction tell us, right? On the one hand, we could say it's quite patronizing about ordinary people who are not in the university. They have real lives and so on. But it also says, well, what is the world of the university? Is it a sort of sphere of dream, or is it a sphere of fantasy? Or perhaps it's a place where things don't really matter, right? It's a place where things are divorced from the world in a way that almost it's some sort of obscure game. There's a wonderful novel by the German and Swiss writer Hermann Hesse, who he fantasized about some society where people would spend this time playing the glass bead game. That's the title of the novel. Away in these sort of almost monastic like colleges or these strange places, playing this game that actually doesn't mean anything at all. Right? And it got me thinking about academia as a game. I mean, if you just think of the word academic, right? It has this wonderful double meaning. On the one hand, it means, something serious. Oh yes, academic study and so on, full of scholarly footnotes and so on. And on the other hand, in colloquial terms, it means something that doesn't matter. It's an academic question. Who cares, right? So I started thinking really about what it might look like if we look perhaps at academia as a game, which looks like it's serious, but in fact it's full of all sorts of ludic pleasures, right? So I guess that in a way is one place that my research has come from. So I use a number of definitions of the game, but an important one is from a Dutch thinker, writer from the 1930s who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, so man at play. So it's a play with, Homo sapiens, and he looked at Homo Ludens, and he looked at the place of play and game in human activity. And his idea of the game is something that's separate from everyday life, spatially and temporally. So, for example, the game I love is rugby. I'm a massive fan of the Welsh rugby team. You think about the rugby pitch that separates off, right, the space on which it's played from the rest of the real world. That's one of it, one sort of border. And the other border, of course, is the temporal border from the referee's whistle at the beginning. Then 80 minutes later, or 80 and a bit, depending if there's more time at the end, the whistle goes again and it's finished. Now, within those borders, certain rules are lifted, right? So that, for example, you're allowed in rugby to tackle someone around the legs and haul them violently to the ground in a way in which you couldn't do, right, in everyday life. And certain other rules are imposed. You have to pass the ball backwards. You're not allowed to be offside and whatever, okay? But it's a separate sphere in which so you can do certain things that you couldn't do in normal life, real life, and you can't do other things. And the other thing about it is, in a way, no matter how serious it is, what happens within the pitch and within the 18 minutes, it doesn't really matter. Right, two groups of 15 men or women can bash the living daylights of each other, but at the end of the day, they can shake hands and go off and have a drink afterwards. It doesn't really matter. So I've been looking at the way in which academia similarly is constructed as this place where we can play. Right, all sorts of restrictions are removed. I can, read French novels and talk about French novels, or we can discuss things we couldn't discuss elsewhere, where perhaps certain rules are imposed. They're the rules of our disciplines. They're the ways that we have to talk about them and what we, there are things you can't talk about and things you can talk about. But the way that ultimately, no matter how seriously we seem to take it as academics, particularly in the humanities, I'm really not talking here about, medicine or engineering. That's different. You build a bridge, right? It needs to stand up. You invent a medical treatment. It needs to heal someone. But in the humanities, how at the end of the day, no matter how much academics and humanities try to convince themselves and convince other people what they're doing is dreadfully important. In fact, we can go up and shake hands, at the end of the match or across the net, and it sort of doesn't matter.
That's really interesting, because I'd also say, looking at it, what you're saying with whether it's reality or not, or if it's just a game, and then bringing in with the humanities and like other sciences and sort of like you said with engineering, you're building a bridge, it's got to stand, but it's still a step away from academically. It's still, I think, a step away from reality, because there's always factors that they can't account for in the lab, isn't there? So isn't that still across the board, isn't there a step away from reality? Because as much as they try to create it within the lab or try to create for every scenario, because otherwise, how else do you explain when the bridges do fall down?
Yeah, I think so. In a sense, those are disciplines that they don't really deal with, and I'm willing to sort of, give the engineers, the medics, far more than the benefit of the doubt. Gratitude for all the things they do in the real world that have an impact. I guess, one of the things I'm interested in is the way in which, you know, academics in the humanities tend to sort of desperately try and convince themselves that what and others, as I say, that what they do is important. And maybe if we just, you know, we're a little bit more honest about the fact that a lot of this is a game, it might be more fun for us, and it might, you know, be a more responsible way to talk. So I'll give you an example. Literary critics, for example, when they look at novels, and here I'm drawing on this wonderful woman's work called Rita Felsky, who's written a whole load of stuff, but I'm a little bit drawing on her, and I engage with her work in my own work. But she talks about what she calls critique, you know, or criticism. And criticism is when an English literature scholar, let's say, looks at you know, novels written in the 19th century, she's desperately keen to show that this text is somehow guilty, right? It's guilty of upholding the patriarchy, or somehow being complicit with imperialism and racism and so on. And somehow holding, you know, the job of the critic is to unearth the sort of wicked crimes, right, that the novel itself has committed, and there's a sort of seriousness with it. But of course, you know, a literary work isn't the same as the business of racism and imperialism and patriarchal oppression. And very often there's a sort of, at least in the discourse of certain sorts of literary critics, there's a tendency to treat the world of representation as if it was the real, right? Whereas, as Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, said, he says, well, the real is what happens when you get hit over the head with a hammer. You know when that happens. But almost to talk as if, you know, literary text can be guilty in a way of something, and then you're the detective who's discovering the crime, or you're the judge and jury who reveal that underneath, you know, the talk of marriage and whatever it might be, in fact, there's some dreadful complicity with patriarchy or with racism or imperialism and so on. And it's a way of sort of, you know, refusing or trying to ignore the fact that they're just like reading a detective novel or solving a puzzle. They're ludic pleasures, right, in that activity. It's not actually as serious as it might seem to be, or at least as certainly literary critics want to present it as.
So is this the research you're talking about here is about the book that you're writing, is that right?
Yeah.
And what about your sort of, is that your everyday research as well, or is that different, you know, sort of work you've been doing before?
Well, no, this is my everyday research. It's a rather curious and sort of, as I say, playful and ludic book that I'm writing, where I tell stories and jokes and talk almost, I invent something of a genre, a sort of critical non-fiction short story. It does relate to work I've done before. So I'd be very interested in the relationship between the playful and the serious, or the non-serious and the serious for a long time. My PhD was, I mean, may seem quite an obscure connection. My PhD was about two thinkers. It was a comparative study of two thinkers. One was the German writer, thinker, literary critic, and so on, Walter Benjamin, who he was 1892 to 1940, and he ends up committing suicide on the French-Spanish border, fleeing the Nazis. He was Jewish, and a lot of his writing seems very melancholy, right? In some ways, he seems a very sort of serious and melancholy thinker. And the other thinker who I wrote about was a Russian literary critic and theorist called Mikhail Bakhtin. And his shtick is completely different. He was interested in carnival and laughter, and the way in which laughter can overturn, right, you know, hierarchies and all this sort of stuff. And so I had, you know, one thinker who traditionally is thought of through the lens of what we know about the way he ended up, and this rather serious sort of melancholy spirit. And on the other hand, we have another thinker who's all about laughter and so on. And what I tried to do, I guess, was to show in some parts of my work what, in a way, try and think of Benjamin the melancholy thinker and find a theory of laughter in him. and think about Bakhtin, apparently the joyful, laughing, carnival-esque thinker, and try and find the seriousness and his concern with things like death and so on. So to see in what ways things that are playful can be serious, and to see the way in which things that present themselves as serious can be playful. So I mentioned that the book has 2 parts. Well, one is longer than the other, but 2 parts. One's about academia as a game, and the other's about literature as a game. Essentially, my argument is that academia looks like it's something that's very serious, right? But in fact, it has a playful side that maybe we ought to recognize, and maybe we could do more with. We could make the play of academia something serious. We could let that game spill out of hand and escape the sphere of game and boldly cross Parker's piece and go beyond reality checkpoint and see how we can, right, make it speak in a much more serious way by admitting that we're playful. That's about academia and the humanities. In literature, right, it looks like it's all about stuff that you can make up that doesn't matter. It's all about play, right? It's sort of, in the sphere of fiction, you can do what you want. You can write about murderers and encourage people to empathize with them. You can, because it doesn't matter. It's an imaginary world we've made up. It's fantasy. But what I try and do in the longer part about literature is show the way in which these literary games can often get out of hand. Right? Because, they can often spill over into real life and have terrible consequences. What happens when a writer talks about real human beings as if they were literary characters? What happens when a writer tells secrets, and tells truths, when in fact a writer maybe should just stick to making things up? Because if you tell the truth, that can have terrible consequences. In what way can literary games spill over the border of the game of literature into the real life and blow up in everybody's faces? Okay, so there's something playful. I want to reveal that it can have a sort of serious side to it. So this relationship between the playful and the serious, I think is something that's always interested me. I've written an article about Brexit, for example, and the discourse of play and seriousness in that, laughter and tragedy in that. I'm interested in, I've written myself, I've written an article that's about the one that was most viewed, most read by anyone, about the tiger who came to tea, right? Something terribly playful, and tried to see that in terms of the psychoanalytic structuring underneath Judith Cale's story of this tiger who arrives, for tea time. But I've also written some dreadfully serious things. So I think there's something there about what academics do, certainly in the humanities. I think it was my 50th birthday the other day, and one of my oldest friends, Johnny, he was kind enough with a couple of other people to do a speech, and he said a most wonderful thing. It was a real compliment. He said, Tim always knows how to be playful about serious things and serious about playful things, right? And I think actually that's what, certainly humanities, what we do. We take something which is a game, which is a piece of literature, and we submit it to immensely serious analysis, right? Yeah. And hopefully we're also able to do the other thing, which is we can be playful about serious things. That's to say, in our classrooms, we can have that freedom to think, without worrying where it goes, about the very serious questions that we ask about birth and love and hatred and death and all those things. Like we allow ourselves to be playful, to think through all the possibilities about very serious things.
I think it's really important work, especially on the literature side, because they are written by human beings, and human beings will include their own thoughts and their own feelings, and so take racism. If there is an underlying feeling of racism, then that will come out in the books, and isn't that, or in the work, or in what's being written or portrayed. And if we take fiction just as fiction, if we take it just as, it's just play, then that's when it gets dangerous, isn't it?
Well, that's really interesting, Pixie. I mean, some of my work really speaks to these quite difficult debates we're having in society at the moment. For example, about questions of cultural appropriation, right? About things, about safe spaces, about cancel culture and so on. Well, now this isn't the primary purpose of what I'm doing, but I think I'm trying to open up those debates and think about them in different ways. And let me give you an example. We talk about, for example, take racism. Well, which we're all agreed is a bad thing, right? But, interesting case recently was with, I think I haven't read it, but Sally Rooney's work? I can't remember now, but essentially the question, so we'll ignore that for a second, but essentially the question, yes, racist ideas are bad, and in real life, people, shouldn't have them, certainly, but shouldn't say them. There's no doubt about that. But in literature, am I allowed to, or should a writer be allowed to have a character who voices racist ideas? And what happens if in that novel that I'm writing, if that character not only voices racist ideas, but is a complicated character? We don't just judge, and the reader isn't just encouraged to judge and condemn that person, but we're invited by the author ultimately to see that there's ambivalence about this character who voices racist ideas. Now, traditionally, that's thought to be okay, because it's been thought you can do what you want in literature because it's fiction, because it's made up, right? Whereas now, people are saying, well, actually, that literary game that people play, maybe it should have rules imposed. Maybe there's not total freedom. No, it's the same about cultural appropriation. Traditionally, the idea has been that, writers the job of the writer is to put her or himself to engage with otherness, into the shoes of other people who might be very different, right? Whether it's a male writer, let's say, voicing a woman narrator or woman characters, or whether indeed it's writing about someone, where there's racial and ethnic difference or whatever it might be. And that precisely is what literature is meant to do, this sort of game, in a sense, where you can pretend to be other people and thus explore the whole encounter of difference and otherness. But some people are saying now, which I could entirely understand, that perhaps that apparently playful thing can have more serious consequences, right? That perhaps we don't have the freedom to do, even in literature, to do everything we want. That pretending to be someone else maybe not be some careful process of feeling your way into their shoes, but it might be dressing up. It might be, wearing Mexican sombreros at a party. That's a specific example, incidentally, that the very dodgy public intellectual Lionel Shriver has been talking about. But that maybe there's some things we shouldn't play with, right? Maybe there's some things that even the supposedly free and open zone of literary play should say, no, we're not going to play with those. Right? Because ultimately, and I think this is where my work does, get much more serious, is play is also a matter of power. Not everybody is allowed to play, right? We see this in the culture more broadly today. Boris Johnson, for example, treats the whole of politics and the lives of of us and our fellow citizens as if we're just bit parts in his game of I want to be world king. Right? Politics become a terrible game. So here we have an example of something that should be a serious matter, politics, being treated by people as if it were a game where nothing matters at all, right? So I'm trying in my work, even though it is a playful and hopefully it's sometimes funny book, and in fact my editor, when he first got in touch with me after I sent his sample, he said, "Oh, Tim, this is great. I'm really excited about this." I was laughing all the way through as I was reading the sample text, and I thought that was marvelous. But it does actually get at some really, really serious things that rightly we're all talking about at the moment.
And is your book is it an academic book or is it a book for the public?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So when I say my editor, so it would be coming out with Manchester University Press, but it was being very difficult to place because non-academic publishers have come back and said to me, "Oh, this is too academic," right? Because I do talk a lot about academia and humanities, and I have various, points of reference, writers, but thinkers, and so on, who wouldn't necessarily make it a little bit seem obscure and so on, and they say, "Oh, it's too academic," and a whole range of academic publishers said, "Whoa, this is too playful. The form is too playful." So what's been really difficult is to try and position it on that boundary where it looks both ways. Yes, I talk about some serious and academic stuff, but the way in which I'm doing it and so on is a way in which I hope anyone could pick it up and go, "Oh, this is quite enjoyable. This is written in an interesting way." But yeah, it's a really, really good question, and I think that actually, your podcast like yours is great. It's trying to straddle that divide, but what's worrying is that it's quite difficult to do. Well, in my experience, it's quite difficult to do. Maybe other people out there are having more success out of it, but precisely because of the way in which we do separate ourselves off from the real world with different sorts of reality checkpoints, to write in a way that is both, that is amphibian. I talk about amphibianism in my book. That's a concept I sort of invent. But to be amphibian, to be part of academia and to love all its obscurity and its complexity and its wonderful words and jargon, but also to be elsewhere and to have different sort of conversations with people who aren't part of that world, that can be quite hard. I do want to, if it's all right, to talk about waffle and language. Would that be okay, Pixie and Em?
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah.
Well, I guess not waffle, right? But language and jargon and the way in which we, as academics, invent and take pleasure in words, right? That we make up that are sort of, they in a way function as another form of border to the game. All games have their own vocabulary, right? Card games have their own vocabulary to, various technical terms, or snooker has its own vocabulary. I don't know, a shot to nothing, or a safety duel, or all these things. Rugby has terms, very specific terms like calling a mark and, all these sorts of things. And in a way, those words construct the game. If you're in on the game, if you understand the words, right? And there have been lots of really interesting cases with us. The famous cases back in the late 90s. There's a guy who's actually at UCL called Alan Sokol. So he's partly professor of mathematics at UCL. But he deliberately wrote this ludicrous article in the most highfalutin sort of post-structuralist, postmodernist jargon that was meant to be about physics and representation. And he sent it to the trendiest humanities journal of the time, Social Text, that was based at Duke University. And it went through the refereeing process and it was accepted. I mean, I'm slightly simplifying. There are books that have been written about this as a Sokol affair, right? And shortly after it was accepted, Alan Sokol pops up and says, "It was a joke. It was a game. It was a hoax. And look, I fooled you," right? And then, because he'd used language in this playful way to sort of indicate the way in which the sort of post-structuralist jargon of these literary critics and philosophers was nothing more than fantasy, had no connection to reality. And then, of course, Social Text and its editors, and in particular the sort of French thinkers like Jacques Derrida, and he's a big sort of character in my book, incidentally, Derrida. I tell numerous stories about him. And they are stories, they're real stories, but they're stories and jokes. I'll tell you one of those in a moment. But they all said, "Oh, this isn't fair. You've broken the rules of the game, Professor Sokol, but you're just joking, whereas we're serious," and so on. So Sokol on the one hand and his sort of Anglo-American common sense brigade, and Derrida and the Social Text editors and so on, they were all arguing about whether the game, the joke that Sokol had played was fair, whether what they were doing was just a game or whether it was serious, right? And it was all about language, the language that was used. And, I point out the many ways in which the way in which, we in the humanities sometimes at the more extreme ends of talk, it just becomes like the sort of meaningless words as if it was some sort of, magical game, some weird game of snooker. I'll give you the example, another story about Derrida. This story is probably not true, okay? Jacques Derrida, extremely important French philosopher and so on, for whom, of course, the Anglo-American establishment, and particularly, analytical philosophers in Cambridge and elsewhere, had a huge amount of suspicion that he was just playing word games. Anyway, the story goes like this. Derrida was apparently at some seminar in the US with graduate students, very serious, and it was a big deal for him to come and for the graduate students to be there, and probably young members of staff, everyone who's a bit trendy in philosophy and literary studies and so on. And the great Frenchman came to give his talk, and he talked and talked for, the first hour of the session, and he was talking about cows. He was kept on talking about cows. And these serious young men and women were scribbling away, taking notes and trying to make sense of it. Anyway, and thinking, yes, how could this fit in where he's talking about cows, these beasts, with the serious post-structuralist philosophy. Anyway, then there's a break, a coffee break, and probably the seminar participants were saying, oh, wow, it's wonderful Derrida's here, and wonderful we can hear his talk. And then the session resumes. And Derrida says, and I'm not going to do a comedy French accent, but he spoke very good English. We did have a strong French accent, which is important here. And he said, it has come to my notice, there's been a mistake. I've not been talking about, I hear the word is pronounced chaos, right? So you've been talking about chaos all the way through. Everybody had been talking, thought he said was cows. Now, okay, it's a funny joke, but how stupid could they have been, right? But it says something quite serious. And I do a whole analysis of this joke. This is a game that everyone's sitting there thinking it can't be cows, it can't be cows. And then you go, oh, it must be cows because Derrida says it, right? So it's like they're living in this complete bubble where no one can admit quite how ridiculous it is. Right? It's the sort of emperor's new clothes. And I used the whole story of the emperor's new clothes a number of times. The emperor's clothes, this ridiculous joke, this game that the tailors play on the emperor, right? And when the emperor parades in front of his, citizens, his subjects, which is also a sort of game, by the way, no one will admit that what actually they're seeing, that in fact, that a game has been played, a joke has been played, and the emperor has no clothes, apart from the little boy, right, who sticks his hand up and says, oh, he's got no clothes, and everybody laughs, right? But it's done through language, right? Through the way in which, this language that we use, I'm not saying that we should all speak without waffle or without jargon, but we should perhaps admit something of the sort of the pleasures of the game that are constructed with the way in which we talk about things in humanities, that of course excludes as well. So yeah, there are various jokes and stories about Derrida, but also about the way in which we use language in the academic sphere.
Yeah, because I'm doing a degree in film. And,
right.
And writing the essay. So I usually get my partner to read over them for me. And he was saying, the last one, he goes, well, it's good. I get the content and everything and it's okay. But he goes, but you're using this language. And he goes, but just say it plain. Just, you're twisting it around and you're trying to make it sound more intelligent or more clever or more academic. And I goes, well, yeah, because I need it to sound more academic. And it's like, because I feel like if I don't write academically, then my, I'm doing inverting commas there, then my tutor who is going to be marking it won't accept it as a definite essay, an acceptable essay if I'm not using words that I think are academic. So we get stuck in the cycle, don't we? That well, because this is what the language the system uses, then I must use the same language as the system to be accepted in the system.
Yeah, I have to learn the rules of the game. I have to become skillful in playing the game. And I think exactly, and that can be serious, right? Once again, learning to play a game can be serious. I remember, and what you say, Pidge, reminds me of something quite serious. I remember having a student who came years ago, but it was a very instructive, from definitely a sort of first generation, non-traditional university background. And she wrote an essay for me, and I was convinced it was plagiarized. It didn't make sense, and it was sort of using, but I looked, I think Turnitin did exist by then, but I looked at online and trying to think, where does this come from? And it just didn't sound right. And I had all these words, and I was thinking, that doesn't make any sense. Why she's using these words? Anyway, I sat her down in front of me and I said, look, this essay really seems plagiarized. Is it your work? And she said, oh, yes, it is. And she was a really decent, as far as I could tell, she seemed decent, honest. It didn't make any sense. And I said, look, can you tell me what this word means? And she said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And can you tell me what this word means? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And it kept on going. She couldn't tell me what half the words in the essay meant. I said, well, are you really telling me it's your work? How did you write it? And what she said was, and this is quite sad in a way, right, was that she had written her essay and then she'd gone into the thesaurus function on Word and she'd gone for all the nouns or all the verbs and she found the one that she didn't know the meaning of because she thought that sounded better. I remember the phrase she used was, I felt I had to fluff up my language. Right?
Oh, brilliant.
So I said to her, look, please, I was at a sigh of relief, of course, that she hadn't plagiarized. And then, of course, we had a chat where I said, look, just don't fluff up your language. Say it in the way that you can say it, and we can work on that and make it better, but don't feel that need. And I think there is something, once again, about what I was saying before about sort of games and power. I'm a ridiculously privileged, middle-aged, white, heterosexual man, and we're people. We're allowed to play games and get away with it in many ways. That's a bit. I've been here forever. I couldn't have written a book like I've written now if I was an early career researcher, and possibly not an early career researcher without the privileges and the various characteristics that I have. Right.
Yeah.
And, to see this young woman who was like, oh, gosh, I have to learn how to play the games. This is a game I don't understand. And I just want to say, don't, be who you are, say it in a way that you know how to do it. So I think, this is a part, once again, of, I'm not saying, everything should be plainly spoken. There's a need for us in the humanities to use words and almost to play with them as well, to reveal some of the complexity and ambiguities that language has. It would be wrong if everything we said, could be done in a vocabulary of 2,000 words. There's good, and we should embrace that. But we also, mustn't get wrapped up in these games and forget that we're playing them, and forget, allow them to be completely divorced from reality, where in fact everybody, everyone's forgotten it's a game and it's sort of, the emperor's new clothes. And there are lots of reasons. And the story you told, but the story I've told about my student, a whole number of years ago, makes that point really powerfully, I think, that it's a serious thing as well.
No, it's really interesting. And it also reminds me of like when you play the game of not using the words yes or no. And so, it's about playing with words and moving things around, but basically saying yes or you're saying no. But it's and that's kind of like what politics is like as well, isn't it? Oh, very interesting.
I was also going to say it's a bit about understanding the game and the rules, but also having an instruction manual. Sometimes you need to have that sort of background to sort of understand how to play it, don't you, to be part of it or to build up to it. So
yes, and I don't know if we want to get over it, but I think that is part of privilege, is not having to need to be told the rules, right? And academia can be a bit like that. It can be, I'm trying to think. think of the representations. I don't know if you watched The Chair, right? The Netflix series that sort of actually makes quite a lot about that, that academia isn't just what we say in the classroom or the lecture room or we write in our articles, but it's a whole load of social games. And you need to, power says you need to learn how to play those too. And I think, incidentally, that series, and I do have a bit on The Chair, and I do have a bit on Squid Game and so on, but The Chair is also about academia as a game, right? It's a really problematic series. It's interested in the, midlife crisis of this, white male midlife crisis, something we've seen before. And why are we not, we're not sufficiently interested, obviously, in the Korean American chair, but let alone the African American PhD student and these other things around him. Anyway, there's a focus on this white middle-aged man. But anyway, at one point he gives a lecture. This is the crucial point of the series. He gives a lecture where he plays at being a Nazi by doing a Nazi salute, right? And his defense could be, well, actually, I was performing that. I was parodying that, right? But of course, the students are, that's not a game. You're a Nazi. So it's an interesting sort of almost generational and split between, it's to do with race and it's to do with gender and it's to do with age, but somehow, he thinks I can treat academia as just a game where we can, I can give a Nazi salute in my lecture. And the students are saying, no, it's more serious than that. That we don't take that as a performance, right? We can't have a Nazi salute in our classroom because that's offensive. Right. And this is interesting too about questions of safe spaces. Traditionally, the university has been perceived as a safe space in itself, where in fact you can say anything. This is about questions of freedom of speech. It's a sort of game. You can try out different positions, whereas increasingly students are saying, no, it's actually only privileged people who get to play that game. And we want spaces, right, where you can't mess around, where you can't sort of just say anything you want because it's all just a game. We actually want different sorts of spaces that perhaps are a more of a truly, and I think this is an important metaphor, level playing field, right? Is the play space of the university, is it a level playing field? And students, particularly and a younger generation of scholars, are saying, no, it's not. And you can't just say what you like, just as they say to writers. You can't just pretend that you're, an African American woman or something if you're a white man. So yeah, once again, play and seriousness and how they intersect.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is. And also, it's like if you it's like when Em's had the idea for this podcast and asked if I wanted to get involved, and it's like, well, no, absolutely yes, because if we don't understand this, if the majority of the public doesn't understand the language of academia and of what they're doing, but it's the research, it's the academics who are governing our world, who are bringing in the research, we're bringing in the changes, we're bringing in the new, and if we don't understand the language that they're using, then the next thing we know, everything that they've brought in is terrible because there's been no stops, because only the same people understand the language and no global representation or balanced representation.
Yeah, no, I do like the idea that academics rule the world. I'm not quite sure. I know what you mean. I do know what you mean. And it's sort of, it can be that language that we use can be a barrier to exclude, and it can be a badge of privilege, right? And take Boris Johnson with his Latin tags, these ridiculous things he throws in. Of course, he could be following the motto of me and many of our colleagues in the sort of language and literature, which is sort of why use an English word when a foreign word will do. But what he's really doing is he's sort of saying, I'm able to treat this as a game. Right? One, I'm able to make these ridiculous jokes about serious things, but also I speak a language, in this case, literally Latin, but more it's a language of culture, it's a language of something that excludes other people. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's an interesting parallel. The introduction I'm writing now does make some of these much more political points about games, right? That, you know, I mentioned before that the ability to play games is often a way of signaling or reinforcing power. So I don't know. It's a way of saying that, you know, you can treat things as if they weren't serious, even if they have serious consequences for other people. And I want to look a little bit about Trump and sort of narcissism, right? The narcissist is the person who doesn't treat other people as if they were real, but they're just pawns in his game or characters in his fiction, right? You know, so there's something. Obviously, look at Johnson, who's, you know, I mean, look, he uses the metaphors of games all the time. You know, years ago, he said, when asked if he wanted to be prime minister, he said, oh, well, if the ball popped out of the back of the scrum, I'd pick it up. Right, literally describing his path to power as a game. It gives a nice, by the way, a nice new take on the phrase, you know, what was it? The Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Perhaps the tragedy of our politics is that our politics has been run, you know, how many old Etonian prime ministers are there? Well, we've had 2 in the last, right, how many years? 10 years, just interrupted by Theresa May. But that we have a political class that treats politics as if it were just a game, whereas it's not, and it has real life consequences for ordinary people and their livelihoods and their health and everything else, right? So once again, the relationship between the playful and serious. But don't get me wrong, this isn't a book that sort of says, or my work isn't about saying that everybody should be serious all the time, right? I think, you know, play is good, right? But we should recognize that it can have serious consequences. And serious things are good. We could recognize they can also be approached in a more ludic way. What I think maybe where things come unstuck, whether it's in literature or academia or indeed in politics, and maybe that's another book, maybe that's a 4th book that I haven't thought about, but it's when they get mixed up inappropriately, right? You know, it's like lying, right? Lying tends to be a bad thing and have bad consequences. But if you lie in fiction, that's great. Right? You know, fiction is a place where you should make things up. And in fact, telling too much of the truth in fiction, like revealing secrets about your children or your partner and saying things you shouldn't, that's when it hurts, right?
Very true.
Lying in real life, but in real life, it's the other way around, right? Generally, it's best to tell the truth, and generally lying is what hurts. So you need to know where you're doing what. You know, and the problem, for example, I'm quite interested in imposters, right? Like, for example, there's this Spanish writer, Cercas, and he writes about this famous imposter in Spain whose name has just escaped me. But this was a guy who pretended to have been deported to the Nazi death camps and escaped. He pretended to have been a resistant under Franco. He pretended all these things. And after Franco's death, he became quite well known. He represented the union of Spanish people who'd been in Nazi work camps, and he represented people who'd suffered under Franco and so on. And it was all completely made up, right? Completely made up, and he was exposed and so on. But Cercas's point is, and the great point of reference in Cercas's book, which is just called The Imposter, instead, if you want to go look up, it's a wonderful read. He continually compares this guy, whose name, shockingly, I've forgotten, to Don Quixote. Don Quixote is a complete fantasist. He believes that he's a knight chasing after windmills and so on. But Don Quixote is a book, right? What the imposter does, this Spanish guy who pretends that he'd been in the camps, he pretends he was a resistant to Franco, is he does something that would be fine in literature, but he plays it out in real life, treating everyone around him, his family, friends, you know, and the Spanish public at large, as if they were readers of some fictional novel he'd written. But that won't do, right? You know, that's when it all goes wrong, because that literary game of making things up has spilled out and become a part of real life. So imposters do that. Fantasists and imposters, and indeed narcissistic politicians like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson do. They treat life, as if all the people in it were just characters in their novel, but also that life as if it was a novel they could write, because they don't believe that anyone else has any validity. They think they've got this sort of all-powerful, authorial, right, authority at the end of it. So yeah, maybe there is a further book that's about politics as a game, and narcissism, and fantasies, and imposters, and so on. I mean, one of the things my book's interested in is the notion that sort of all literary works, or all art, in fact, might come out of play, right? That it comes out of this basic need for human beings to have a sphere where things don't matter, right? Where we can sort of fantasize, and so on. Freud suggests that, it's unconscious wishes that are at the heart of the artwork, that, the things that we can't say in real life, we can transform in, things we want. These desires are transformed into the fantasies of literature. So I write a little bit about literary games, and very often literature, they are puzzles, like detective stories are puzzles that are set, or they're games that authors play with their readers and so on. But I guess I'm more interested in the way in which these games can get serious. And I look at a whole range of literary texts where games are played that, for example, can't be brought an end to. Pidge, you mentioned earlier, the game of you can't say yes or no. Or there's another game that people play, which is, say the opposite to what you actually think, right? Children will do that. Well, how do you bring that to an end, right? Someone needs to say, I don't want to play anymore. And then everyone will go to, you can't bring the game to an end. And sometimes literature will have these, really interesting depictions of this. Games, for example, where people end up getting what they wished for, right? And it ends up being, something that they really don't want. So the classic example is the story of the peasant couple and the sausage, the 3 wishes, right? Where one says, what you get 3 wishes from a fairy, and one says, I'd really like a sausage, and then the other one's really angry. She says, I wish the sausage was stuck on your nose, and then they have to use the 3rd wish, right, to get rid of it. It's a literary depiction of a game, a wish, a fantasy that's ended up with these bad consequences. The other examples would be stories about holidays which you can't escape from, right? When, like Deliverance or Southern Comfort or whatever, where you go in, or The Wizard of Oz, where you step off the yellow brick road and everything turns out nightmarish. You go off into Deliverance, into the woods in the south, and you step off the trail and somehow you can't get back from it. So I have a whole load of discussions of these texts that portray literary games that get out of hand, right? The way in which they get serious and have consequences. And then I look at, particularly non-fiction texts that end up intervening in real life, where people, for example, there's one, many of these are in a French context. There's a French writer, Camille Laurence, who writes about her son's death, a terribly sad story, and her partner takes her to court because, he says, you haven't got the right to turn this into literature. You haven't got the right to do this. So sometimes literary games can get out of hand and they end up in court. And there someone else says, has this broken a different set of rules? Not the rules of literature, but the rules of law. Right. But I think the interesting thing I also do in my book, and this is the 3rd part, is I sort of bring together the 2 parts together of the book together. So we've got the book about academic games, we've got the book a bit about literary games, and then the 3rd part, there's one particular writer, Emmanuel Carrère, who's an incredibly well-known French writer. He's like in the top 5 of French writers today, massive seller, and he's now successful in English. But he writes these non-fiction games, which are very much about his involvement with other people, and they very often end up with him causing terrible harm to the people around him. right? So I write about him and his books, but I also write about my relationship with him and the way my encounters with him and the games there, that what I say in the book might end up blowing up in my face. So there are two things that are going on there, and it's a little bit complicated, this third part, but I think it exhibits what I'm trying to do in the other two. On the one hand there, I'm talking about the games that writers play and the way in which they can have terrible consequences. But also what I'm doing is going back to the first part about academia, is I am taking what is normally just a game and implying it to something that's absolutely real life, which is my relationship with this man, and the way that what I say about him and our real life exchanges could also have terrible consequences. So I'm almost like taking the game of academia and playing it beyond reality checkpoint. So we'll see. I've shown him, I say some pretty dreadful things about him in this book. I've shown him drafts of the text, but we'll see afterwards whether all of this blows up in my face.
I can't wait.
Normally we round up the podcast by saying, could you explain to us why your research is important?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting point. I think it is amphibian research. That's to say, on the one hand, I think it's not important at all. I'd like to think that much more, I mean, I think I talked to you a little bit about my PhD that came out of the book. It was dreadfully serious. And I don't think there were any jokes in it, and it was worryingly pious. Whereas this book, I think, I have this story I tell it's quite long. It's about 5,000 words about the Slovene art theorist and Abraham the Inuk, this native Canadian, and all these things. And I like to think that it's enjoyable, that it is, it's playful. On the other hand, I do like to think that it's got the seriousness, a little bit of the little boy, right, in the Emperor's New Clothes. And I think it maybe asks us to reflect, maybe this is a serious point, about this relationship between serious and non-serious, between games and this real life that lies outside. And maybe it makes us consider that boundary and those ways in which those two worlds can coexist and overlap, both for good, because I love games. Everybody loves playing games. I love rugby, and I love that freedom to invent and do new things and not be bound by the boring constraints of the real world. But also to think about the way in which those games can get serious and can have real life consequences. There might be some things we shouldn't play about, some jokes we shouldn't tell, and those sort of things. So if that's important, I don't know. I leave that up to the reader to work it out.
I think it's important.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tim. It's been really nice talking to you.
It's a pleasure. I hope it was clear enough. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody for listening to us. We'll put up links on our Twitter account, which is at Anti-Waffle Pod. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in contact, please do email us at antiwafflepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.